So I'm here at the yet another round of the climate talks with Alan Gross from Mediators Without Borders, and I saw his booth here, and it reminded me of Ted Keel, who I wrote about recently on .earth, who was a master at getting into a room with people with pretty hardcore disputes and finding a way forward. So I was just asking Alan some things, and I'm going to ask him to sort of play the role of the mediator. Suppose the basic parties, blocks here, got it knocked on your door at Mediators Without Borders, and they said, here I am, we're the super poor countries, here we are, we're the emerging less poor countries, China. I'm the United States, and over there is Europe and the rest of everybody, and we've got a big problem. And here you've probably gotten a sense of what these problems are about. They're about money, vulnerability, responsibility. What would you do? What's your first step?
First of all, from your lips to God's ears, we wish we had an opportunity to mediate between these people, because right now they're just making speeches to each other and posturing to a large extent, although there's some good intentions here. So what some mediators would do, and they all have different techniques, what I would do is separate them, talk to them individually, and try to dig down to what their real interests are, if they're willing to be transparent, that's a big mediation word, and honest with us, and then, only then, talk to them about how they could try to understand what the other parties were trying to get across before they. It's much easier to speak than it is to listen. So if they can understand each other, then they at least have an opportunity to seek common ground and to buy into a mutually acceptable solution instead of one that's imposed on them by some international court. Mediation is very much about self-determination of the parties. It's about neutrality and confidentiality, but it's allowing the parties to determine for themselves what they think is important and voluntarily agree with it. So if they voluntarily agree with something, they can hardly disagree with themselves. So they're much more likely to comply, carry it out, and not feel imposed upon. Even compromises are not as good as a mediated agreement.
Is it fundamentally harder? I assume it's fundamentally harder when you have fundamentally different vantage points. There are more than two. In other words, where there's poor people who feel vulnerable to something rich countries have already been doing. Then you have this emerging giant power, China, that is no longer poor, but doesn't feel responsible. What does that feel like?
It is more difficult the more interests that are in the room to find some commonalities. I mean, that's just a mathematical probability statement. But the mediator really is not an expert necessarily in cap and trade or carbon emissions or anything else. It's good that we know those terms so people don't have to explain them to us. But what we want to do is have the parties understand each other and decide whether they can agree with each other voluntarily.
Yeah. There's one party that isn't represented here, and that's the future. One thing I've written on my blog is about this question of, in fact, some ethicists have said there needs to be a legal guardian for the future. Like, do that too?
We don't say that, but we're very future-oriented because most disputes are mired and stuck in the past, in the history, and there's tremendous repetition about you did this and you did that and this is your fault and we were good and you were bad. Mediators don't talk about innocence or guilt, or we try to get people unstuck from the history and move forward, move ahead. What can we do now? This is the situation. What would you like to do now? So that's the future. It's not the unborn children, it's the future in the room.